There exists, inscribed on the invisible walls of the human mind, an ancestral mechanism, a filter that was not designed to reveal truth, but to protect certainty. This is confirmation bias, the original sin of anyone who has ever held a coin and believed they possess not just metal, but wisdom. It is not an occasional error of judgment, but the very architecture of how we process the world. We seek not what is true, but what echoes our pre-existing beliefs. We collect evidence like a collector who only accepts blue butterflies, ignoring the entire garden in its chaotic diversity. And in this obsessive curation of reality, we build not fortresses of knowledge, but prisons of illusion. The market, that great tribunal of human nature, does not forgive those who confuse validation with truth. This is the fable of the selective mirror, a story etched on ancient scrolls about a merchant who learned, too late, that the most dangerous mirrors are those that reflect only what we wish to see. In the lands beyond the misty mountains, there existed a port city called Portus, erected upon black stones, where the sea beat eternally like a clock counting fortunes. It was a city of pointed towers and bustling docks, where ships arrived laden with spices that perfumed the air with cinnamon and clove, where merchants traded not just in gold, but in whispered information, in trade secrets guarded like treasures. There lived a man named Silas, a merchant of 45 years, graying hair combed with precision, eyes always calculating margins, always weighing risks. He had built his fortune upon a singular and profound belief. The trade of exotic spices was the only true path to lasting wealth. This was not mere speculation. Silas had invested early when others hesitated, and had reaped profits that validated his vision year after year. His warehouses overflowed with black pepper and saffron. His house on the hill dominated the port like a monument to his own foresight. He was not merely successful, he was a prophet whose prophecy had been fulfilled. But success, that drug more potent than any spice, had worked a subtle transformation in Silas. Each prophet became not a lesson in gratitude for fortune, but a confirmation of his superior genius. Each accurate prediction solidified not humility, but unshakable certainty. He began to curate his own experience, to select his own memories. When younger merchants asked about his methods, he pointed to the packed warehouses as if they were irrefutable philosophical arguments. When advisors suggested caution, he cited his own history as if it were natural law. His belief had crystallized from hypothesis into dogma, from strategy into identity. He was no longer a man who invested in spices. He was the spice merchant. And this distinction, this fusion of identity with investment, would seal his fate in ways he could not yet foresee. It was on an autumn afternoon, when leaves fell like copper coins upon the market stones, that a mysterious traveler arrived in Portus. No one knew where he came from. This man in dark robes with eyes that seemed to see through things. He set up a small tent in the antiquarians district, and among his wares was an object that caught Silas's attention. A mirror framed in carved ebony with symbols no scholar could decipher. The glass was not ordinary. It had an opaque quality, almost smoky, as if it contained trapped mist. The traveler, perceiving Silas's interest, approached with a smile that did not reach his eyes. This, he explained in a voice that seemed to come from far away, was the selective mirror, forged by forgotten alchemists who sought not truth, but the peace that comes from absolute certainty. The mirror possessed a singular property. It did not reflect the world as it was, but as the observer believed it to be. It showed only information that confirmed the pre-existing beliefs of whoever consulted it, filtering all contradiction, all doubt, all uncomfortable challenge to the established vision. Silas, touching the cold frame, felt not alarm, but recognition. Here was a tool that would cut through the confusing noise of the market, that would separate the true from the false, that would show him only what mattered, only what was relevant to his proven strategy. He bought the mirror for a price that made other merchants laugh at his extravagance and installed it in his office, positioned facing his work desk, where all important decisions were made, and he began to consult it. Every morning, before the sun painted the port golden, Silas sat before the selective mirror and asked his questions about the market. The surface darkened like deep water, then cleared, and there appeared visions. Distant markets, conversations in taverns, merchant reports, price forecasts, and each fragment of information the mirror offered confirmed exactly what Silas already believed. If he was convinced that pepper prices would rise, the mirror showed him reports of weak harvests in distant lands. If he doubted new silk markets, the mirror whispered stories of bankruptcies and frauds in that sector. Never a contradiction, never a challenge, only sweet and reassuring validation. This is the deadly mechanism of confirmation bias. This is the trap that captures not fools, but the intelligent, not the ignorant, but the informed. The human mind is not a blank slate awaiting objective data. It is a passionate lawyer, building case after case in favor of conclusions it has already adopted. We seek evidence that supports our beliefs with the same desperate intensity that a thirsty man seeks water. And when we find it, we experience not just intellectual satisfaction, but deep chemical pleasure, a release of neurotransmitters that rewards not the discovery of truth, but the confirmation of our pre-existing views. Each validation strengthens the neural connections that support the belief, making it more resistant to future challenges. Silas's Selective. Mirror was merely the physical materialization of this psychological process, an object that made visible the invisible filter through which we all, to greater or lesser degree, see the world. And while he consulted his mirror day after day, while he drank deeply from this poisoned fountain of certainty, two visitors arrived at his door, messengers bringing gifts he did not wish to receive. The first was a man named Erasmus, known in Portus as the astrologer, though his true craft was more complex. Erasmus studied long-term economic cycles, historical patterns of boom and collapse, the invisible tides that move markets across decades. He carried rolls of parchment covered with intricate charts, data tables reaching back generations, analyses showing how the current spice boom fit into a larger and more threatening pattern. Erasmus came to warn Silas about troubling signs his studies had revealed. The prosperity cycle of spices was entering its terminal phase, a process his historical data suggested would end in dramatic collapse within the next 2 years. There were specific indicators: growing price volatility, overproduction in competing regions, shifts in consumption patterns favoring cheaper alternatives. Erasmus unrolled his scrolls on Silas's desk, pointing to correlations, to historical precedents, to the anatomy of past bubbles that seemed to mirror the present alarmingly. He represented the voice of contrary analysis, the data that challenged the comfortable narrative, the wisdom of empirical reason shouting warnings no one wanted to hear. Silas looked at the charts, felt discomfort rise in his chest like nausea, a visceral sensation of rejecting information that threatened his worldview. Almost reflexively, his eyes turned to the selective mirror hanging on the wall behind Erasmus. The surface glowed softly, and there Silas saw not the troubling data Erasmus presented, but a reassuring vision. Merchants in distant ports celebrating profitable deliveries, warehouses being built to accommodate growing demand, analysts he respected publishing optimistic forecasts about spices. The mirror showed him articles by merchants who were also deeply invested in spices, all arguing that this cycle was different, that the old patterns no longer applied, that a new era of permanent prosperity had arrived. Silas felt the discomfort dissipate, replaced by familiar certainty. He thanked Erasmus with formal cordiality, promised to consider his analyses, and dismissed him. The scrolls remained on the desk for a few days, unread, before being stored in a drawer that would never be opened again. After all, the mirror had confirmed what Silas already knew. Erasmus was a chronic pessimist, seeing patterns where there were only coincidences, projecting historical fears onto a fundamentally transformed present. The second visitor arrived a week later. It was a woman named Helena, known as the cartographer, though her work transcended physical maps. Helena mapped risks, alternative routes, diversification strategies. She had built her reputation helping merchants distribute investments across multiple commodities, multiple routes, multiple markets, weaving safety nets that protected against isolated collapses. Helena came to offer Silas something he didn't think he needed: a balanced portfolio. She unrolled maps that showed not just spice routes, but also emerging opportunities in northern wool, grains from eastern plains, textiles from mountain regions. Her calculations demonstrated how distributing capital across these diverse avenues would reduce catastrophic risk while maintaining reasonable profit potential. She pointed to Silas's dangerous concentration. He now had 90% of his wealth tied to spices, dependent on a single network of trade routes, vulnerable to any interruption in that specific system. Helena represented prudence, the mathematical wisdom of not betting everything on a single outcome, the humble recognition that the future is fundamentally uncertain and must be approached with strategic caution. Silas listened politely, but while Helena spoke, he mentally consulted his selective mirror, remembering the visions it had shown him the morning. The mirror had projected Helena's arguments as manifestations of irrational fear, the defensive philosophy of someone who had never experienced true success. It had shown Silas examples of merchants who had diluted their profits through excessive diversification, who had achieved only mediocrity because they refused to have true conviction. When Helena finished her presentation, Silas responded with the condescending patience of one who knows secrets others cannot comprehend. Diversification, he explained, was for those who doubted their own analyses, for those who lacked courage to back their convictions. He had built his fortune through laser focus, through total commitment to his investment thesis. Why would he now dilute what clearly worked? Helena left her maps, but Silas folded them carefully and placed them in the same drawer containing Erasmus's unread scrolls. He did not need multiple routes when he had absolute certainty about the correct route. And so, month after month, Silas deepened his commitment to a conviction that had become indistinguishable from his own identity. He began liquidating his small remaining positions in other sectors, selling stakes in wool consortiums, disposing of small agricultural properties that produced grains. Each coin released was immediately reinvested in spices, in expanded storage capacity, in futures contracts betting on rising prices. His advisors watched with growing concern, but Silas interpreted their hesitations not as wisdom, but as lack of vision. He consulted the selective mirror daily, sometimes multiple times a day, and each consultation reinforced his confidence. The mirror had become more than a tool. It was his most trusted advisor, more loyal than any human friend, because it never, ever told him what he did not want to hear. He had built around himself a perfect echo chamber, where only one narrative was permitted, where only one truth could exist. And in this comfortable and dangerous isolation, he prepared his final move. Silas conceived a plan of audacity that made other merchants tremble. He would invest 100% of his liquid capital in a single massive expedition, a fleet of 12 ships that would travel to the most distant spice islands, purchase monumental loads at wholesale prices, and return to sell with margins that would transform him from wealthy merchant into legendary magnate. It was a gamble that required not just capital, but substantial loans against his properties. It was a bet that left no margin for error, no safety net, no contingency plan. When he announced his intentions at the Merchants Guild meeting, the silence that followed was thick as fog. Some tried to argue against the extreme concentration of risk. Others reminded him of Erasmus's warnings about the economic cycle. But Silas, standing before his peers with the selective mirror polished in his mind, smiled with the confidence of one who possesses superior knowledge. He had consulted his mirror. He had seen the future, and the future showed absolute triumph. The fleet departed on a spring morning, 12 ships with sails that caught the wind like promises catching hope, each carrying not just capital, but Silas's entire identity transformed into wood and sail. The entire city came out to witness, and Silas remained on the dock until the last mast disappeared on the horizon, a thin line between sky and sea. And then he returned to his office, to his selective mirror, and consulted it one last time before the long wait. The surface glowed with almost blinding intensity, showing him visions of triumphant return, of overflowing warehouses, of wealth multiplied beyond his most ambitious dreams. The mirror showed him his own image crowned with laurels, recognized as the greatest merchant Portus had ever produced. Never, in his entire history of consulting it, had the mirror been so emphatic, so definitive in its confirmation. Silas sat in his leather chair, surrounded by ledgers documenting his ascent, and waited with the patience of one who knows the inevitable. Weeks became months, spring ripened into summer, and summer began its slow transformation into autumn. Silas maintained his routine, consulting the mirror daily, always seeing the same reassuring visions. Other merchants began reporting disturbances in spice routes, rumors of political conflicts in producing lands, whispers of port closures. But when Silas consulted his mirror about these rumors, the surface showed them as exaggerations by envious competitors, as disinformation spread by those who had lost the courage to invest aggressively. The mirror systematically filtered any information that might disturb the narrative Silas had constructed. When a messenger brought news that one of the ships had been delayed by storms, the mirror showed Silas that delays created scarcity that would elevate prices even more when the fleet finally arrived. When rumors circulated about changes in consumer preferences, about spices being replaced by cheaper synthetic alternatives, the mirror dismissed this as passing fashion without substance. Each potential challenge to Silas's thesis was reinterpreted by the mirror as additional validation. Each obstacle transformed into opportunity through the alchemy of selective confirmation. And then came the day when a different messenger entered Portus, a broken man riding an exhausted horse, with torn clothes and eyes that had seen terrible things. He brought news that made the city's bells toll in lament, that made merchants run to their guilds in panic. The so-called Northern Storm, the collapse Erasmus had predicted with his cycles and historical data, had arrived. It was not a single catastrophic event, but a cascade of interconnected bankruptcies. Spice prices had collapsed first in distant markets, then spread like plague through trade routes. Political conflicts in producing regions, exactly as predicted, had closed critical ports. The overproduction Erasmus had identified in his data had finally saturated markets, driving prices below transportation costs. And amid this systemic collapse, Silas's fleet of 12 ships had been caught completely unprepared. 6 ships had been confiscated by warring governments. 4 had sunk in storms that meteorologists had predicted, but which Silas, consulting only his mirror, had never known about. 2 had returned, but their spice cargoes were now worth less than the loans taken to purchase them. Silas's total bet had resulted in total loss. Silas sat in his office, now strangely empty because he had already begun selling furniture to cover the first demands of creditors, and looked at the selective mirror. And for the first time since he had acquired it, the mirror showed him nothing. The surface remained dark, opaque, offering only his own reflection, the face of a ruined man staring back at him with eyes that finally saw. He rose slowly, took the mirror from the wall, felt the cold weight of the ebony frame in his hands, and with a movement that seemed inevitable, like water finally finding its natural current, he hurled it against the stone wall of the office. The glass exploded into 1,000 fragments, each piece reflecting a different truth he had refused to see. Erasmus's warnings he had ignored, Helena's diversification maps he had discarded, the risk reports he had filtered, the voices of caution he had silenced. The fragments covered the floor like fallen stars, and Silas knelt among them, finally understanding that the mirror had never deceived him. He had given the mirror exactly what to show him: confirmation, validation, the comfortable illusion of certainty in a fundamentally uncertain world. He sought out Erasmus, and found him in his observatory, still studying his cycles, still mapping patterns others ignored. The astrologer showed no satisfaction at Silas's ruin, only the deep sadness of someone who had seen this tragedy unfold many times before, in many different lives. He explained to Silas that the stars, his historical data, his predictive models, had never lied. Silas had simply chosen to consult only oracles that echoed his own voice, had built around himself an information system that functioned not to discover truth, but to reinforce belief. Confirmation bias, Erasmus explained, was not a character flaw, but a feature of human cognition, an evolutionary mechanism that served our ancestors but betrayed modern investors. The solution was not to eliminate beliefs, but to systematically seek their refutation, to actively look for data that challenged them, to build processes that forced consideration of contrary perspectives. He had tried to be this process for Silas, but no external process can function if the individual internally refuses to listen. Silas sought out Helena in her map office, where she still worked helping other merchants distribute risks to build balanced portfolios. She unrolled her maps again, showing him the alternative routes he had ignored, the investments in wool and grains that had prospered while spices collapsed. If he had allocated even 20% of his capital in these alternatives, he would have survived the spice collapse. If he had kept the small agricultural properties he had sold in his fervor for concentration, he would have residual income to rebuild. The diversification he had scorned as cowardice was actually courage of a different type, the courage to admit uncertainty, to recognize that no man, however intelligent, can predict the future with certainty sufficient to bet everything. Helena offered no judgment, only the same cartographic wisdom she had offered before. The territory is vast and treacherous, and those who survive are those who map multiple paths, who always maintain escape routes, who never confuse a map with the territory it represents. Silas never recovered his previous fortune. He ended his days not in his house on the hill, but in a modest apartment in the artisans' district, working as a consultant for younger merchants, those wise enough to seek perspective from someone who had learned the hardest lessons. But he recovered something possibly more valuable than wealth: clarity of vision, genuine humility, the capacity to see the world not as he wished it to be, but as it was. He wrote a manuscript in his final years, a treatise on the dangers of certainty that he titled Reflections in Darkness. In it, he argued that the greatest risk faced by any investor was not market volatility or unforeseen events, but the very architecture of their minds, the inexorable tendency to seek confirmation instead of truth. He described the selective mirror not as a magical object, but as a perfect metaphor for the modern algorithms that curate our news, the social circles that reinforce our beliefs, the mental processes that filter reality through preference. The manuscript circulated discreetly among serious merchants, never becoming popular because its truths were uncomfortable, but profoundly influencing those courageous enough to absorb its lessons. This is the lesson of the fable. This is the truth that Silas paid his fortune to understand. Confirmation bias is not merely a logic error that can be corrected through education. It is a feature of human cognition, woven into the way our brains process information, optimized by evolution not for objective truth, but for decision speed and narrative coherence. Our ancestors survived not by being impartial philosophers, but by being confident storytellers who could interpret patterns quickly and act with conviction. But the modern financial market rewards different characteristics. It punishes mercilessly those who confuse quick pattern recognition with wisdom, who treat their first impressions as definitive conclusions, who build identity around investment beliefs, such that changing one's mind means dismantling one's very sense of self. You, sitting there consulting your own invisible mirrors, your algorithmically filtered news feeds, your investment groups that function as echo chambers, are in danger of the same seduction that destroyed Silas. The question is not whether you have confirmation bias, we all do, but whether you recognize this and build systems to compensate. The modern investor faces an informational environment infinitely more complex than Silas. You can, in seconds, find articles, analyses, opinions, data that support absolutely any position on any investment. If you believe a certain stock will rise, algorithms will deliver dozens of optimistic analyses. If you doubt cryptocurrencies, your feed will show you articles highlighting frauds and collapses. The very design of modern information platforms is optimized not for truth, but for engagement. And engagement is maximized by showing people what they already believe, because confirmation is comfortable and confrontation is aversive. You are living inside a technologically sophisticated selective mirror, and unless you actively fight against this, you will succumb to the same illusion of certainty that destroyed Silas. The Erasmuses of the modern world are the analysts who publish contrary reports highlighting risks that optimistic investors don't want to see. The Helenas are the boring financial advisors who insist on diversification and risk management when you want to concentrate everything on the next hot stock. And most of us ignore them, dismiss them, filter them, exactly as Silas did, because they tell us uncomfortable truths that threaten our preferred narratives. The solution is not simple, but it is clear. You must become your own Erasmus, your own Helena. You must systematically, deliberately seek information that contradicts your investment beliefs. When you are convinced a stock will rise, force yourself to read bearish analyses. When you are optimistic about a certain sector, look for reports highlighting structural risks. Follow analysts and commentators who frequently disagree with you, not to convert them, but to expose yourself to alternative perspectives. Build decision-making processes that institutionalize skepticism, that require formal consideration of negative scenarios before committing capital. Keep an investment journal not just documenting your decisions, but explicitly listing the reasons why you could be wrong, creating a record you can review when confirmation bias begins to distort your judgment. And above all, cultivate intellectual humility, the recognition that you may be wrong, that the future is fundamentally uncertain, that absolute certainty is always dangerous illusion. This is the wisdom that markets reward. This is the discipline that separates those who survive long-term from those who, like Silas, learn too late that mirrors that reflect only what we wish to see inevitably guide us into darkness. Subscribe to discover the hidden truths in markets, the fables that illuminate not what we want to believe, but what we need to understand to survive in a world that does not forgive illusion.